Welcome back to the TWSN YouTube channel. My name's Aidan Maher, and today I'm going to be talking about Mitchell Trubisky's value in 2022 for fantasy football, because I personally believe we could see a top 12 finish in the cards for Trubisky, which some people view as a hot take, but I'm about to break down why that shouldn't be a hot take at all. Let's get into it. All right, first I want to take a look at Big Ben's recent finishes in fantasy and where the Steelers have been in terms of passing volume. Now, in 2021, Big Ben finished as QB 21 over 17 games. Nothing to write home about at all. But what I do find noteworthy is the Steelers' passing attempts. With Big Ben being a complete shell of himself, could barely hold his own back there, the Steelers were still fourth in the NFL in passing attempts. And in 2020, when Big Ben wasn't great, but was at least a little better, finished as QB 13 that year, by the way. And keep in mind, Big Ben is bringing no rushing value to the table. So he finished QB 13 in 2020. And the Steelers were first in the NFL in passing attempts. First. Their complete motto over Big Ben's entire career, over the past 10 years, whatever you want to say, they have consistently been top 10 in the NFL in passing attempts. Most years they've been top 5. And I know 2019 was an exception. They were not top 10 in passing attempts, but keep in mind that year they were cycling between Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges, just terrible quarterbacks. The game plan's not staying consistent. It was just an absolute mess. But, I mean, as much as you might want to say that holds value, again, look at 2021. With Big Ben being a complete shell of himself, they were still fourth in the NFL in passing attempts. And I know that part of it is, last year, for example, the Steelers, a lot of quick passes. The Steelers know that their offensive line is an issue, and they counteract that. They counteract it with a lot of quick passes to their playmakers, to Najee Harris, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, Pat Freiermuth. That is something that did not happen in Chicago for Mitchell Trubisky. In 2019, that year where he had that severe decline in efficiency, the Bears were 13th in the NFL in passing attempts, and they had an awful offensive line as well, similar to Pittsburgh. But Matt Nagy, for some reason, was just insistent on all these long developing passing plays, which when you have an offensive line that can't hold its own, and then you decide to run all these long developing passing plays, that is just an awful combination. That'll never succeed in the NFL. So what happened to Trubisky was he's taking far more sacks, he's speeding up his reads, and he's hyper-targeting Allen Robinson, who's really the only competent receiver on that team. The situation, again, the game plan here in Pittsburgh is much better than it was in Chicago. The coaching is much better than it was in Chicago. The receiving core is much better than he ever had in Chicago. But even then, 2018, that Pro Bowl year, was kind of a glimpse of some of the upside we can see from Trubisky in fantasy. In 2018, that year, the Bears were only 25th in the league in passing attempts, which is a pretty low volume. But still, nonetheless, Trubisky managed to finish as QB 15 in just 14 games, which on a points per game basis had him finish QB 10 that year. With 24 passing attempts, 12 interceptions, over 3,200 passing yards. But it was really the rushing volume that did him in. 68 rushing attempts for 421 yards and 3 touchdowns. That is what took him over the edge. Trubisky is an underrated runner. He brings that value as a rusher. So we're talking about it. I'm not defending Trubisky as a real quarterback. The elite days for him are over. That ceiling is not there. He's simply not that great. But as a fantasy quarterback right now, entering Pittsburgh, a team where you're pretty much guaranteed top 10 passing volume, and you're talking about a good receiving core, and Mitchell Trubisky, a guy who brings rushing value, that's kind of what we're looking at for these fantasy quarterbacks. That's what we want to see. So I did a bit of a study here. Over the past 5 years, since 2017, I compiled all the quarterbacks who were top 10 in passing attempts and also had a minimum of 40 rushing attempts in their respective seasons. And we compiled a pretty good list here. In 2017, there were only 2 guys that met this threshold. That was Russell Wilson and Kirk Cousins. But in 2018 on, there were over 5 guys every single season. Now, there's one exception to this, which I'll talk about in a minute. But every single one of these guys who hit those 2 thresholds of the top 10 in passing attempts and the minimum 40 rushing attempts finished with over 20 fantasy points per game. The one exception was Trevor Lawrence. And I know a lot of people want to say, well, that just proves your model is inaccurate, right? It doesn't hold validity. I disagree. Let's take the context into consideration here with Trevor Lawrence. This was a rookie quarterback that was entering an all-time bad situation. Awful head coaching. The offensive line was not up to par. The receivers certainly were not up to par. But he smashed both these thresholds because he brought that rushing value. He's a good runner. They ran RPOs with them, all that stuff. And because the Jaguars' defense was also extremely terrible, the Jaguars were constantly forced to throw their way back into football games. So the volume was there for Trevor Lawrence. And I know a lot of fantasy people, including myself, will tell you volume is key. Sometimes efficiency does matter. It does. Efficiency still does play a factor there. And because Trevor Lawrence's situation was so awful, despite that volume, he still only put up 12 passing touchdowns to 17 interceptions. Sometimes the situation's bad enough. But with Trubisky, that's simply not the case. 2019 was a bad situation for Trubisky. Not as bad as what Trevor Lawrence just had to deal with, but it was still bad. And still, that year, Trubisky wasn't that bad. He was still almost basically doubled his touchdown production to his interceptions. Again, it wasn't a great year in 2019 by any means, but he wasn't that bad. And now we're talking about him going to a much better situation in Pittsburgh. Again, it's an upgrade in terms of the coaching staff, the receiving core, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you're guaranteed basically that top 10 passing volume and a minimum 40 rushing attempts. Those are thresholds that feel, to me, pretty easy for Mitchell Trubisky to hit. They do. And keep in mind, all the guys over the past 5 years that have hit that, except for Trevor Lawrence, the one exception, who, by the way, too, I want to add this in with Trevor Lawrence, he averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game last year. That is 4 less than the next lowest scorer to hit all these thresholds. Like when you take into the context and that stat, like all of it, he is so obviously just an exception to this rule. But again, all those other guys have averaged a minimum of 20 fantasy points per game that hit both these thresholds that are pretty easy for a Mitchell Trubisky to hit this year in Pittsburgh. And I'll just say this, 20 points per game over 17 games last year would have finished as 2021 QB6. Now, Trubisky might miss a couple games, and that might bump him down a little bit in the total ranks, but if we want to go on a per-game basis solely, 11 quarterbacks finished with 20 points per game last year. So, realistically, Mitchell Trubisky could easily have a top 12 fantasy season this year at the quarterback position. And I don't think it's all that spicy of a take if you look into it. A lot of people, though, will undervalue Mitchell Trubisky because they're kind of writing him off as a bust. He's not that great of a real-life quarterback. We haven't seen him in a minute. I get all those things, but fantasy quarterbacks and real-life quarterback, like those rankings are different. When you have this type of passing volume with these receivers, you flashed the fantasy ceiling not that long ago, and you bring rushing value, that is what you're looking for in a fantasy quarterback. That's what leads to the success. That's what leads to fantasy points. And the true buy low window with Trubisky has passed. I was saying, go get Mitchell Trubisky in January, February. I was smashing that all day. Because at that point, okay, Trubisky, we've heard great things out of Buffalo, and the supply and demand of the quarterback market is completely lopsided. So many teams looking for a quarterback, yet the supply is so thin that I would find it absolutely insane. Unbelievable. Like, there's no way that this former second overall pick just a few years ago that made a Pro Bowl just a few years ago doesn't end up getting a second chance when you have all those excuses of a bad situation and all that. Like, he's going to get a second chance, and he did. And he went to Pittsburgh, which is one of the best potential landing spots he could have ended up in. So his value's only gone up for me, even more since that point. But still, this is still a good buy. I don't want to say double stills there, but this is, a very good buy low spot even now. I know his value has moved up a little bit. You can no longer get Mitchell Trubisky for a late third round pick like you could a couple months ago, but he's still valued between a mid to late 2022 second round pick. If you're a contending team in need of a third quarterback, even a second quarterback, go out and get Mitchell Trubisky for that price. I'm telling you right now, in the middle of the second round of your rookie drafts, there'll probably be a few guys you still kind of like, but there's a big drop-off in the middle second round in this year's rookie drafts. And even just compared to some of these other quarterbacks on Keep Trade Cut, at least, which is, taking into consensus's rankings here, Matt Ryan is valued ahead of Mitchell Trubisky, which makes no sense to me. Trubisky is not only like 8-9 years younger than Matt Ryan, but he's basically guaranteed both more passing volume and rushing volume next year. And not only that, he's got a better receiving core. I know Matt Ryan, the team overall is better. We can say maybe the Colts are a little better. He's got a better offensive line for sure. But Trubisky, the volume's going to be there for him over Matt Ryan in both the passing game, the rushing game. It doesn't make any sense to me. Now, in terms of redraft versus dynasty, Trubisky's redraft ranking is definitely going to be higher than where you'd slot him in dynasty. Redraft, you're obviously just worried about 2022. And in 2022, he realistically could finish as a high-end QB2 to a low-end QB1. At worst, he's probably a mid QB2. That's kind of his floor, mid to low QB2. And we love that for 2022. But the reason his dynasty ranking is going to be a little lower is because after this year, his job is extremely fragile. We could see the Steelers take a Matt Corral, a Malik Willis, and that quarterback eventually next season bumps Trubisky down to the backup role. There's a chance that Trubisky's year just isn't good enough, and the Steelers just decide to part ways, and Trubisky's a backup for the rest of his career. Could be the case. His job is fragile after this season, but nonetheless, I'm higher on him in consensus and dynasty because I love his value for this upcoming season. And there's a chance he gets another stint with the Steelers after that. So, I don't know. I just think Mitchell Trubisky, as much as the prime buy low window has passed on him, that was January, that was February, this is still a good buy low point for Trubisky because he remains undervalued. And I seriously think we could see a high-end QB2, low-end QB1, that top 12 finish absolutely could be in the cards for Mitchell Trubisky this season. Well, that's going to wrap up today's video. Before I get out of here, I want to make sure you guys all go subscribe to the TWSN YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. We've got live shows and content like this coming out on a daily basis. You don't want to miss out. I've also got the links to the TWSN Patreon page, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that jazz, all the stuff you want to stay up to date on. All the links, again, to those should be in the description. But other than that, that's going to wrap it up for me. I hope to see you guys next time.